it is definitely backfiring. As I said, in the immediate term, no one is going to mess with Putin, but this is not, shall we say, legitimacy and support. This is the caution that you have around someone who's demonstrated himself to have poor impulse control and a large gun. So, like I said, I think increasingly people are seeing themselves more as his hostages rather than anything else.
So, Mark Galeotti, what impact do we think Prigozhin's assassination is going to have on Putin and his inner circle?
Well, in many ways, we've got to recognise that it's not an expression of power so much as of failure. I mean, first of all, the kind of horizontal disputes, the feuds between individuals and institutions, which are so central to the Putin's system and really how he controls his elite by constant divide and rule, well, that really relies on Putin being able to nip conflicts in the bud before they become real problems. And he clearly failed to do that. And look, in a properly working police state, you shouldn't need to have to commit such pyrotechnic acts of assassination, because basically everyone should know where the lines are and why they should not cross them. So it's an expression of failure. In the short term, of course, everyone's going to be very much sort of tiptoeing around, because clearly what Putin has done is shocking. But in the longer term, I think it will contribute to that sense that ultimately Putin now is no longer in quite such a commanding position as he was in the past.
And how do you think that's changed Russia's elite's sort of understanding of Putin and his role as leader?
I mean, what we have to understand is there are no Putinists, really. This is not an ideological regime or whatever. The elite on the whole is made up of ruthless, pragmatic, opportunist kleptocrats. They support Putin because it's dangerous not to, but more to the point because by supporting him, they become rich and powerful. It's not that they have any great sympathy for him. So the thing about this is, therefore, that Putin is powerful and successful so long as he's seen as both a winner and also impossible to challenge. Now, increasingly, we're seeing from the elite's point of view, first of all, that he's not necessarily good for business. A lot of them are actually in much, much less advantageous positions than they were in the past. They have assets which they put outside the country precisely to keep them safe from Putin himself, which are now being frozen and sequestered. And there's an element in which, where from their point of view, look, what's the point in stealing on an industrial scale, which is what they all do, if you can't then enjoy the full fruits of that, if you can't get spare parts for your Mercedes, if your yacht has been impounded off the Italian coast, and that nice little penthouse that you plan to buy in London is now somewhere you can't travel to. So, for all kinds of reasons, Putin is not looking quite so good for business. Secondly, he's no longer looking quite so secure. I mean, one of the really striking things about Prigozhin's mutiny was not just the mutiny itself, but the degree to which so many within the security forces, both the military and the internal security forces, they didn't join Prigozhin, but nor were they under any particular enthusiastic mood to try and stop him. In some ways, this was them abstaining from that conflict and just sitting back and seeing what happened. And the thing is that we, just like the Russian elite, had assumed that Putin had a pretty rock-solid level of support within that security apparatus, so that was the final backstop. Now, I think from the elite's point of view, they'll be looking at it and thinking, it's rather more conditional than we thought. And finally, when Putin starts killing people that he'd made personal guarantees to, that matters. Again, it might sound bizarre to think of just it being shocking that Putin would actually lie or change his mind. But the bottom line is this. This is not a system that depends on laws and constitutions and such like. It's a system which, like a mafia gang, depends on personal relationships. Your word has to be good. Otherwise, no one can possibly trust you. And up to now, although Putin was perfectly happy to break international law and do all kinds of ghastly things, he did seem to be someone who did understand that and would essentially stick by his guarantees to people who are insiders, people in his circle, like Prigozhin. Now he's turned on Prigozhin, for understandable reasons. No one's going to be actually mourning Prigozhin himself. But again, it speaks to the elite about a new, much, much more worrying, much, much more unpredictable era in which they're increasingly feeling more like hostages than partners.
Do we think then that Prigozhin's assassination was sort of inevitable from the moment he gave up on that mutiny, essentially?
I mean, it's difficult because obviously whenever anything happens, people will always say that it was inevitable, that it was going to happen. Look, we know that Putin is not one to forgive and forget. I must admit, my assumption had been that, there clearly had been a deal struck. Prigozhin, basically, that's it. Wagner is out of Russia and Ukraine, but it must continue to operate in Africa, where it earns money for the Kremlin, but even more importantly, political traction. And if one looks at Prigozhin's last video, which he recorded in Africa and released just before his fateful flight, these were the words of someone who thought that he had clearly time on his side. He thought he had a job to do and the time to do it. It was quite a confident thing. So it seems to have been that certainly at one point Putin was minded to give Prigozhin at least some time to demonstrate his utility, to demonstrate his loyalty. So, I mean, my assumption had been that, maybe Prigozhin had a year or so now, in which maybe then after that, particularly if he hadn't proven to be particularly useful, then maybe he should be worrying about open windows and the like. But the very fact that Putin flip-flopped so quickly, some people would say it's because he was trying to lull Prigozhin to a false sense of security or was carrying out an investigation in who backed him. I don't really buy that, because he didn't need to worry about Prigozhin's concern. He could have had Prigozhin arrested at any point or killed. And likewise, his investigation didn't need Prigozhin to be alive. And so I think this is very definitely a case in which Putin at first he thought he was a traitor during the mutiny. Then he decided that, in fact, it was just about acceptable because it wasn't, after all, the mutiny was not geared at trying to topple Putin, but to persuade Putin to back Prigozhin against his main rival, Defense Minister Shoigu. Then Putin clearly made a deal with Prigozhin. He offered a pardon to him and his men and a sort of a future working outside Russia. And then he decided to kill him. I think this is the sign not of a man who is working on some complex, carefully drawn out plan, but of an aging and worried dictator who decides one thing today and then changes his mind tomorrow.
So do we think this was entirely Putin's decision, or was that pressure that we heard of from army chiefs part of the reason for Prigozhin's death?
Well, first of all, look, it's always very hard to know in this system exactly where the initial imperative comes from. But I think one thing that is absolutely clear is that Putin must have, at the very least, approved the killing. We have seen in the past, after all, other cases of assassinations which seem to have been done without Putin's say-so. The classic one being of a former opposition figure called Boris Nemtsov, whom Chechen leader Ramzan Kadyrov had gunned down literally right by the Kremlin. And at that point, we clearly saw a degree of panic and chaos in the Kremlin, and Putin himself disappeared from view for 2 weeks while he was trying to work out exactly quite what to do and how to manage this. There's been none of that this time round. It's all been handled very smoothly and neatly and quickly. So this clearly did not catch Putin by surprise. Whether the initiative actually came from the military or not is in some ways irrelevant. And I think, to be honest, I think from the military's point of view, Prigozhin had been defanged. I mean, already his mercenaries were being encouraged to actually join the regular military or one of the other mercenary groups that they concern. I think the real imperative would have probably been political. That, we know that the Kremlin is constantly, secretly maintaining a lot of polling activities going on. Probably, I think Putin was horrified to see actually how well Prigozhin and his mutiny had resonated with the Russian people. And therefore, I think that's, and again, this is just my speculation, my guess really, is probably what tipped Putin over the edge, that sense that Prigozhin might well be politically dangerous.
For someone who is politically dangerous to Putin, is a sort of almost strange and sudden death like this quite standard for Russian politics? Or is this going to be seen as something of a step change in Putin's policy?
I think it's a bit of a step change. I mean, first of all, look, people, again, we know that there's been this sort of like meme about people falling out of windows and so forth. And there have been a lot of distinctly sort of dubious deaths, some of which actually, it's worth noting, I think were genuine suicides. People who, had been building sort of whole business empires and were suddenly finding them collapsing around them. Most often, though, beyond that, actually the Kremlin, in my opinion, is not responsible for these unexplained deaths. These are more the results of horizontal rivalries over resources. I mean, it's inevitable. What happens is when the national pie is shrinking, the struggle to maintain or even expand your slice of it get all the more vicious. So we're really seeing, just like in the 1990s, that murder is becoming a business tactic in Russia. But of course, there are some times when the state actually goes after them. I mean, we've seen the cases of Litvinenko and Skripal here in Britain. We've seen the attempted poisonings of both opposition leader Alexei Navalny, who's now in prison, and indeed Russian-British joint citizen opposition figure Vladimir Kara-Murza, also now in prison in Russia. So the state does kill people, but the key thing is almost every case, these people are whom we could consider to be outsiders. They were defectors, or they were liberal opposition politicians or whatever. Prigozhin was not that. Yes, of course, he had mutinied at that last minute, but up to that point, he was very much a government insider, part of the elite themselves. I think that's what's going to be shocking for them. Not, as I said, that they actually have any sympathy for Prigozhin himself, who was a vicious thug, but the very fact that people who, up to now had considered that the worst thing they faced was maybe an arrest and sent to prison, more likely being dismissed, now they could be being scraped up off the ground after some mechanical incident brings their plane down. That definitely is a step change. And again, I think it shows something about how this regime is shifting into a much more paranoid mode, but also how what was up to now a kind of, I hesitate to call it soft authoritarianism, but sort of postmodern authoritarianism that tried not to be outright dictatorial, is now turning into, frankly, a good old-fashioned, unpleasant, vicious authoritarian dictatorship.
Like you say, we had previously seen poisonings, people being arrested, people disappearing, dying under suspicious circumstances. But it almost seems excessive to have Prigozhin killed in a plane crash. Is it possible this is a faked death, or is this really sort of Putin trying to send a message here?
Again, unfortunately, with Russia, we always have all these sort of excitingly bizarre conspiracy theories. I can't see the advantage of a fake death, to be perfectly honest, because as is, Putin gets all the negative political impact of having murdered his opponent. And for what? I mean, it's not like he needed to worry about Prigozhin or whatever. And I think it's highly unlikely that Prigozhin himself would have faked this and he's going to turn up sipping pina coladas on, a beach in Thailand or whatever. Or that there's going to be some sort of Scooby-Doo moment when a mask gets ripped off. I think that when it comes down to it, we have to sort of assume that Occam's razor applies, and the simplest explanation is the right one. Not least because can you imagine the scale of the intelligence operation that must be continuing to be mounted by the West? Remember, the thing about Prigozhin is he's not just a thuggish and unpleasant individual; he's a war criminal. And therefore, if he steps outside of Russia and a few other countries such as China and the like, he becomes susceptible to being arrested, extradited, and turning up in a tribunal in The Hague. It's not just that Prigozhin wouldn't want that. The Kremlin wouldn't want that. So I think, when it comes down to it, I think we should assume that Prigozhin was in that plane.
In that case, should the firing of General Surovikin, I think not even 12 hours beforehand, have been something of a red flag for Prigozhin to get out of town and not certainly be in the air above Moscow?
Yeah, look, Surovikin's fate was pretty much guaranteed. I mean, this is a man who was close to Prigozhin, had the unfortunate distinction of being frequently praised by Prigozhin at the very time when Prigozhin was also sort of calling the defense minister and the chief of the general staff morons and traitors and such like. And when the mutiny happened, Surovikin recorded this appeal to the Wagner fighters, which, an appeal that really had all the spontaneity and vivaciousness of a hostage video, and then disappeared from view. And given the situation, it seems clear that, in fact, Surovikin was being investigated precisely because of the suspicion that he at least had some inkling of the mutiny beforehand and might even have actually been involved in it. And after a certain point, I think it was fairly clear that Surovikin was not going to be returning to his job as commander of the air forces, the aerospace forces. So, in some ways, the actual day when they formally announced that he was losing his position, I mean, I think in hindsight, yes, we can see it as a part of a general kind of clearing of the decks. But again, before this, I don't think we regard it as being that significant. I mean, or sort of part of some kind of trend. It was interesting that, as you say, it was so close together. On the morning in which the news about Surovikin broke, I was actually at a gathering with a bunch of other sort of defense analysts and so forth. And this was a topic of conversation for us. And this is what we assumed was going to be the day's news. And then by dinner time, we had the news of Prigozhin. So we obviously lumped them together. But I think from Prigozhin's point of view, he didn't really have much of a choice. I mean, sure, he could have chosen not to get on a plane. But look, if the Russian state is after you and you are in Russia, then basically the Russia state is going to get you. So I think from his point of view, again, I think you reach a certain stage when you just have to sort of operate the way you operate.
But will other generals, such as Gerasimov or Defense Minister Shoigu, are they going to be kind of happy about this, or are they at least going to feel maybe they're now in a more secure place?
Yeah, I think from their point of view, it's actually a matter of deep satisfaction. I mean, Shoigu in particular. Shoigu is he's not a military general. He's essentially a civilian who's put in charge of the defense ministry, the same way as in Britain, Secretary of State for Defense is a civilian. He was getting all the flack for what's going wrong in the war without actually, and I don't understand if I'm sympathetic towards him, but nonetheless, it wasn't actually his responsibility. It was Putin who decided the war, who basically sprung it on the entire military high command, and who continued to micromanage. But in some ways, Shoigu's job had become to be Putin's flak jacket, to be the person who absorbed all the criticism, which really should have gone to the president, who is the commander-in-chief. And so he'd had to take a lot of stick from Prigozhin. And clearly he was working on his own political fight back. But nonetheless, I mean, I think he and Gerasimov must be very sort of satisfied to see Prigozhin gone. Because in some ways, look, these are two guys who are incredibly unpopular. I mean, Gerasimov actually frankly shoulders much more of the blame for the disaster of the war, because he's also commander of the forces in Ukraine. Now, though, it'll be quite difficult for Putin to sack them, at least for a while, without it looking as if, in fact, he's posthumously agreeing with Prigozhin. So I think they're both relatively secure. And in that respect, I mean, it's interesting because we're seeing a bit of a little sort of, I wouldn't want to call it a purge. That makes it sound much too sort of dramatic. But certainly some generals being demoted or moved to less significant positions, or in one particular case, actually dismissed. And in part, I think this is actually a symptom of the paranoia now gripping the system. In that, I think Gerasimov himself is clearing the decks. I mean, he's conscious of how vulnerable his position. Surovikin, for example, I mean, who is a deeply unpleasant man, but also a very able one, and had been picked generally by most as the person most likely to succeed Gerasimov as chief of the general staff. It may well be that Gerasimov actually helped give that final nudge to push Surovikin off the ledge. And likewise, a lot of the others, we've got, for example, commander of the airborne forces, the paratroopers, General Chaplinsky, whose supporters are saying, he'd do a much better job of chief of the general staff, while Chaplinsky himself is maintaining a very low profile. I'm just doing my job here, precisely because it's become politically dangerous to look as if you're angling for Gerasimov's job. So, I mean, again, and this is all, again, dysfunctional. Generals who really ought to be working together to try and work out some kind of strategy to withstand the Ukrainian counteroffensive are too busy covering their backs or scheming against their rivals.
So this is actually not just a within Russia problem on the home front as such. This is going to have an impact for the invasion of Ukraine.
It will. Again, it'll take time, and I don't want to overplay it. I mean, the impact on a soldier shivering in a foxhole at the moment is going to be pretty negligible. But first of all, Wagner is now essentially, maybe it'll survive in Africa, but as a unit on the Ukraine front, that's it, it's over. And we have to remember that, it was one of the most effective forces that the Russians had at their disposal, and that they were clearly keeping it back as a kind of reserve force. So if the Ukrainians did punch through the Russian defensive lines, Wagner will be one of the units they'd have rushed to do it. Well, they won't have that at their disposal. Secondly, absolutely, there's this dysfunctionality within the high command, and the fact that Gerasimov is there. In some ways, Gerasimov, I'd almost begin to describe him as one of the Ukrainian secret weapons, because he's doing such a bad job. I mean, even the very fact that Surovikin built the defensive lines, particularly in the south, that the Ukrainians are having so much trouble chewing through. But Gerasimov, who then took over, he's still trying to advance up in the northeast. Totally pointless, breast-beating bit of machismo that actually has no strategic value at all. But I think Gerasimov is desperate to try and provide some kind of prize to Putin and say, boss, you see, I've captured this town or whatever for you. So actually, so long as Gerasimov remains in place, then that job is not going to someone who's more able. And actually, what's happened with all this mutiny keeps Gerasimov in place longer. So it's all very indirect. It's all very long term. But yes, this definitely has an impact on the battlefield.
Do you think then that Prigozhin's death ultimately is going to secure Putin's position and, as part of that, support for his invasion? Or is it does it remain to be seen whether this actually could now backfire?
Well, I'll stick my neck out and say that I think it is definitely backfiring. As I said, in the immediate term, no one is going to mess with Putin. But this is not, shall we say, legitimacy and support. This is the caution that you have around someone who's demonstrated himself to have poor impulse control and a large gun. So, like I said, I think increasingly people are seeing themselves more as his hostages rather than anything else. But in the longer term, as I said, it worries the elite. It makes them feel that Putin is less, for want of a better word, trustworthy, but also stable. It implies to them that his system is increasingly losing its grip. And it also highlights the degree to which the security forces themselves are no longer that united in supporting him. So although we're nowhere near there yet, and things will have to get a lot worse, or there has to be some kind of really systemic problem, maybe, for example, a collapse of the Russian lines in Ukraine, or we're seeing the Russian economy under pressure with the ruble having lost a lot of its value, maybe some kind of cascading economic crisis at home, but something that makes people within the elite think, oh gosh, we actually have to do something, rather than just kind of keep your head down and hope things are better tomorrow. At that point, I think now the elite will feel more able to start to potentially conspire against him. Again, we'll have to wait and see. I mean, I'm not promising that quickly the elite will turn against Putin. But given that it's almost impossible to think that Ukraine can find any kind of real security while Putin is in the Kremlin, even if they've driven Russian forces out of every square centimeter of Ukrainian soil, Russia will still be a threat. So I think ultimately, even in terms of Ukraine's security, there needs to be some kind of changing of the guard in the Kremlin. And that, I think, is closer. Just don't ask me how long it'll take.
Mark Galeotti, thank you very much for your time today.